Hello, everyone, and welcome to Back to Ashes. My name is Phoenix. To the members of the channel, thank you so much for your dedication and love. It comes back to you tenfold. If you are new and haven't been here yet, welcome. And if you begin to like what you are hearing as I'm narrating, please leave a like and comment down below. It does let me know that you are enjoying the content, and it also lets you to know as well. If you would like to join Back to Ashes, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and make sure your notification bell is set to all. That way you know every time I upload a new video. With that being said, it is now time to go back to Ashes. So sit back and relax, kick back, grab a snack, or tuck in and get warm, and prepare for your dose of vocal melatonin entitled More True Disturbing Stories. Right after this intro, there will be an ad. I'll read the first story, there will be an ad. And after that, there will be no more ads within this video. Enjoy. The Thing That Waits in Sloan's Valley. We graduated in 2012. For the first time in our lives, no one could tell us what to do. We had real jobs, mostly reliable cars, and cash in our pockets instead of begging our parents. The world felt wide open, full of promise. But some promises are better left unkept. Sloan's Valley had always been there in the background of our Kentucky childhoods, like a half-remembered nightmare you try to laugh off in daylight. Teachers mentioned it the way you'd warn someone about thin ice. Parents spoke of it like a threat. Older cousins swore that somebody's brother, friend, daughter, mother, or grandfather had gone down there and stayed lost for 12 hours or longer. It was one of those local legends that sat in the corners of your mind, waiting. So when Dwayne said, "Dude, let's finally go see it," something cold uncoiled in my stomach. But we were young, invincible, and stupid. We all jumped at the chance. It was late summer, thick and humid, middle of the week. The country roads were empty. Steo drove his faded red Silverado, the exhaust rattling like a dying man's cough. We stopped at the marathon station just outside of town and loaded up on jerky, sunflower seeds, energy drinks, and a couple of cheap headlamps. "You think this is enough?" Steo asked, shaking the plastic bag. "Dude, it's a hole in the ground," Dwayne laughed. "We're not summiting Everest." The clerk behind the counter looked at us too long. "You boys headed to Sloan's?" We nodded. "Better get you some extra batteries," he said quietly. "I heard a story once or twice." We bought the extra box. Looking back, that should have been the first warning, but we were too excited to listen. Our directions came from some ancient forum thread, vague notes about a sinkhole in a tree line. "You'll know when you see it." And we thought we did. The first entrance was at the bottom of a shallow wooded depression. It wasn't an entrance anymore. Heavy gauge wire fencing surrounded it. Steel posts driven deep. 3 separate no trespassing signs, zip-tied along the perimeter. The message was clear and hostile. "How can somebody own a cave?" Steo muttered. Dwayne kicked the fence lightly. "It's underground. Should be public, right?" I felt genuinely offended, like something that belonged to all of us had been stolen. We drove on. The second spot looked more promising at first. No fence, just a clearing and a worn dirt path. We parked and started unloading gear when we heard an engine. A four-wheeler emerged from behind an old barn we hadn't noticed. The man riding it was mid-50s, sunburned, chewing tobacco like it had personally offended him. He didn't wave. "Boys lost?" he asked. voice flat. We told him what we were looking for. His jaw tightened. This is private property. We tried explaining. We wouldn't damage anything, just a quick look. He shook his head slowly, more exhausted than angry. State sold off chunks of this land years ago. People think just because there's a cave under it, it belongs to everybody. It don't. I run folks off of here every weekend. He sighed, almost reluctant. There is an entrance on public land about a mile east. Old pull-off. You'll see cars if people are actually down there. He pointed vaguely. Just be careful. It's a lot bigger than you think. Back in the day, kids used to get lost down there. Took days to find daylight again. We thanked him and left, but his words clung to us like damp air. The third spot was exactly as he described. A narrow gravel shoulder, barely wide enough for 5 vehicles. 4 cars were already there. 3 looked normal. The 4th was ancient. Oxidized paint, flat tire, leaves packed thick around the wheels. It hadn't moved in years. Steo stared at it. You think somebody's still down there? Shut up, Dwayne snapped. But we all felt it. That low, crawling unease, like the car was watching us. The entrance wasn't obvious until you pushed past the brush. The earth simply opened. A narrow drop, maybe 20 feet down into perfect shadow. Someone had rigged an old rope. It looked ancient. Faded fibers, mud-caked, dark stains that might have been blood. You first, Steo said. Dwayne grinned, clipped on his headlamp, and started down. Watch and learn, boys. Halfway, he slipped hard. The grunt echoed up the shaft like something in pain. We followed anyway. The rope held, but it was mostly desperate sliding, burning palms, and raw fear. My right foot lost purchase 5 feet from the bottom. I dropped hard. The impact jolted through my heels and ankles like a lightning. When Steo reached the bottom, the circle of daylight above looked like a dying star. Tiny, distant, already unreachable. It felt less like descending and more like being buried alive. We turned our lights forward and walked into the dark. For the first 20 minutes, it was everything we'd imagined. Passages widened into smooth limestone corridors. The ceiling arched overhead in elegant scalpeled waves carved by water eons ago. Our headlamps painted everything in sickly gold. It felt like a playground. Then we entered a chamber so large our lights couldn't reach the far wall. When Steo killed his lamp as a joke, the darkness that swallowed us wasn't normal. It was total, absolute, the kind of dark that has weight. It pressed against my chest and stole my breath. Turn that back on, I whispered immediately. My voice sounded small. We kept moving, drifting deeper. The passages slowly tightened. First sideways shuffling, then hands and knees crawling, then belly work. Sweat helped us glide through the squeezes. About 40 minutes in, we hit the real squeeze. 14 inches at best. Flat, oval, pressed between 2 unyielding shelves of limestone. It looked like a nightmare. Dwayne went first, of course. Then Steo. I went last. The rock pressed against my chest like it wanted to feel my heartbeat. My shoulders wedged. My head scraped the ceiling with every inch. Halfway through, my pack snagged. For one horrible second, the earth felt alive, like it had decided to keep me. I finally sped out into open space, gasping. But then I looked up. I couldn't see their light. I couldn't hear them. The passage had forked. I called their names. Only silence answered, the cave swallowing every sound like it was hungry for it. I told myself they were just ahead. Sound travels strangely down here. I stayed calm. 45 minutes later, every corridor looked the same. I started marking my path with my heel in the dust, but I kept finding my own marks again. The cave was looping me in circles, playing with me. Then I saw a flicker of light down a low corridor. Relief crashed through me. I shouted and hurried toward it. My foot met nothing but air. I fell. The impact was brutal. My ankle exploded in white-hot agony. My head bounced off limestone. My lamp flickered once, twice, and died. The darkness that rushed in wasn't empty. It felt personal. It felt ancient. It felt like it had been waiting for me specifically. I fumbled for my backup flashlight. The weak beam revealed a small, rough chamber. The ledge I'd fallen from was too high to climb with my ruined ankle. The only way out was another miserable mouse hole in the floor. I crawled in. The tunnel never widened. It pressed tighter and tighter until stone scraped both shoulders. I heard something moving in a side passage. Slow, deliberate, blind writhing in the dark. It didn't sound human. I kept going straight until the tunnel ended in a blank wall, inches from my face. Dead end. Turning around in that space was hell. By the time I reached the fork again, my hands were bleeding and my mind was fraying. Only one direction left, the one with the strange noises. It got worse immediately. The ceiling dropped. The walls closed in until I had to turn my head sideways. My twisted ankle dragged behind me like dead weight, sending fresh waves of pain with every push. Then I heard it. Faint rushing water or moving air. Hope flared dangerously. The tunnel bent sharply. My beam hit something solid, blocking the way. Boots, soles facing me, wedged tight in the crawl. My heart leapt with stupid, desperate relief. Dwayne, holy shit, man. The boots didn't move. Theo? Guys? Nothing. I inched closer. The leather was dark, stiff, crusted. The legs were impossibly thin, fabric clinging to bone where muscle should have been. The smell hit me like a physical blow. Thick, sweet, rotting. I gagged violently. Those boots had been there a long time. Years. The body was jammed headfirst into the stone. Backpack strap caught on a jagged finger of rock. He had died trying to get out. Slowly, in the dark, alone. And now, I was staring at my future. Panic took me. I thrashed, wedging myself tighter. The tunnel squeezed my chest until I couldn't breathe. The dead man's smell coated my throat. I forced myself to stop. Inch by agonizing inch, I backed away, never taking my eyes off those boots until the bend hid them. But the stench followed me like a curse. I eventually dragged myself back to the chamber where I'd fallen. There, Curled against the wall, I broke. I cried like a child, ugly, heaving sobs that echoed weakly around me. I saw my own death in vivid detail, flashlight dying, screaming until my voice gave out, starving, bleeding, becoming another set of boots, waiting in the dark for the next idiot. At some point, the tears stopped. I noticed a small bulge in the limestone wall beneath the ledge. Using every ounce of strength and friction, I climbed. It was ugly and desperate, but I made it. I crawled back through the spaghetti passages, drained, half dead inside. Then I saw light ahead. Real white. Two beams sweeping the walls. Steo! Their voices cracked with disbelief as they rushed toward me. They grabbed me like they weren't sure I was real. Dude, where the fuck did you go? Steo demanded. I thought you were gone. Like, gone, Dwayne echoed. I tried to tell them. The words came out broken. They had found markers. They knew the way back. The walk out felt eternal. When we finally reached the vertical shaft, the tiny circle of sky looked like salvation. Dwayne went first. Halfway up, his boot slipped. He fell 12 feet and landed with a sickening crack. His scream was raw, animal. His ankle was shattered. Steo and I scrambled out, adrenaline giving us strength we didn't have. We sprinted for a signal and called for rescue. Hours later, as the sun bled out across the horizon, the professionals brought Dwayne up on a litter. A medic checked us over. You fellas okay? I nodded, then added quietly, there's a body down there in one of the side tunnels. The medic barely reacted. Yeah, most caves are full of dead bodies. Most of them just haven't been found yet. Behind him, the black mouth of Sloan's Valley sat silent and patient, swallowing the last of the daylight. It is still down there, waiting. We don't go into caves anymore. Now we spend our time warning kids about what really lives in Sloan's Valley. Not just the dark, not just the squeezes, but the patient, hungry stillness that never lets go of what it catches. Some holes don't just swallow light, they swallow futures. Okay, normally I don't butt in, but I'm going to this time. I'm not claustrophobic, but that story made my palms sweaty. I don't go like cave exploring, but that right there is the reason why. You couldn't pay me enough to even go into a cave, unless it's like a guided tour, but still, no. So for all the crazy people that like going into caves, you all can keep that. I'm going to sit behind my microphone and continue to narrate. Back to our stories. The Taste of the Damned. My name is Rick, and I grew up in Bowl Heights, the kind of Los Angeles neighborhood where the air always carried the faint scent of danger and fried food. My parents came up from Michoacan before I was born. I was their anchor baby, the golden ticket that was supposed to anchor them to a better life. Mom and I were close, but my father, he vanished when I was still in diapers. Told her he was stepping out for beer and never came back. Must have been some exotic brand because I never saw his face again. I dropped out of high school in 10th grade. Not because I was some noble son sacrificing for my mother, but because I was sick of the bullshit. teachers who didn't care that gangbangers were trying to recruit me in the hallways, classes I was failing anyway. Rather than drag it out, I walked, started working whatever jobs would have me, washing cars, hauling drywall, night janitor shifts in downtown warehouses where I mopped up other people's piss and puke from the loading docks. The owner would sometimes slip me an extra 50 if the mess was especially nasty. That's where I learned the real money was, in cleaning up what nobody else wanted to touch. So, when my cousin told me about crime scene cleanup, my ears perked up. Legitimate company, city contracts mostly. They didn't clean up after cartel hits. They came in after the cops were done photographing the horror, suicides, stabbings, overdoses, where the bodies had cooked in a hot apartment for weeks until the neighbors finally complained about the smell. Pay started at $22 an hour plus hazard bonuses and overtime. For a guy with no diploma, it felt like striking gold. After a short training class with an old Korean instructor who'd been doing the job for 20 years, I was in. He didn't sugarcoat it. 1 in 20 of you will quit by the end of the first week. A third gone in a year. You'll see things that'll eat at your soul unless you're already dead inside. Blood, fluids, things that used to be blood, things that used to be skin. We learned about blood-borne pathogens, Tyvek suits, enzyme sprays that could dissolve proteins, and how to double bag biohazards. I thought I was ready. My first job was a one-bedroom where some guy had blown his head off. The smell hit me like a physical blow before we even opened the door. I nearly vomited inside my cheap cloth mask. That was the day I learned to plug my nostrils with Vaseline. We cut out the soaked carpet, scraped the walls, and sprayed chemicals until the place looked untouched. 6 hours later, it was like nothing had ever happened. I got paid. I felt seasoned. 6 months in, I was working with Choi, Randy, and our usual supervisor, Frank, a hardened veteran who knew every trick to make the job faster and safer. But that night, Frank wasn't available. We were already a man down when we got the call for an alley cleanup. A prostitute stabbed to death. Forensics would be finished at around 3 a.m. We rolled out from the depot just after 2:30, grateful it sounded like a simple hose-down job. We arrived late. The cops were irritable, eager to leave. After the handover, they peeled off into the night, leaving us alone with the blood-stained alley. We started suiting up. That's when he appeared. An older white man in a long dark trench coat stepped out of the shadows like he belonged there. He introduced himself calmly as the family's pastor, said the murdered girl's parents had asked him to come pray at the exact spot where she died. He told us how she'd been led astray in middle school, fallen into drugs and prostitution. The family hadn't seen her in years. They couldn't bear to come themselves, so he volunteered. His voice was soft, sincere, laced with practiced sorrow. He looked the part. He sounded the part. We didn't have the heart to tell him to leave. Instead, we gave him 10 minutes. Troy and Randy walked to the 7-Eleven for coffee and donuts. I stayed behind, or at least I was supposed to. I figured a man of God wasn't going to cause trouble. What harm could prayer do? I sat in the truck, eyes half closed, trying to catch a few minutes sleep. Something made me look up. He had crossed the police tape. He was on his knees in the exact place where the girl had bled out, his hand sliding slowly across the dark, sticky pavement. My stomach tightened. I jumped out of the truck and shouted, "Yo, Padre, you can't touch that shit." He didn't even flinch. I watched in growing dread as he lifted his blood-smeared hand to his face. The old Korean instructor's warnings screamed in my head. This was insane. Suicidal. There was no telling what diseases that girl had been carrying. "Hey, stop," I yelled, jogging toward him. "You can't." He rose smoothly to his feet and turned. The words died in my throat. Thick smears of the dead girl's blood covered his lips and chin. His eyes were wide, gleaming with something far worse than madness. They shone with pure, radiant satisfaction. A slow, blissful smile spread across his face as if he had just tasted the finest wine. I felt my skin crawl, every hair on my arms rising in primal warning. "Get the hell out of here," I snarled, stepping closer, but not too close. I didn't want his contaminated hands anywhere near me. "You're done. Leave. Now." He didn't look afraid. He didn't look ashamed. If anything, he looked fulfilled. Then he began speaking. The words spilled from his blood-stained mouth in a language I didn't recognize. It wasn't English. It wasn't Spanish. It had rolling R's and harsh, guttural ch sounds that reminded me of Italian or maybe Greek, but older somehow, darker. The cadence felt wrong, like a chant or an incantation rather than normal speech. His eyes never left mine. He raised his hand and pointed at me with his index and pinky fingers extended, the universal sign for horns, while that eerie smile stayed fixed on his face. I backed up instinctively, not because I believe in curses, but because this man clearly did. He watched, raving like a lunatic. He was composed, deliberate. He had lied smoothly about being the pastor, woven a convincing story, and then calmly crossed every boundary to do this. That calculated pleasure was what truly terrified me. He kept speaking, his voice low and rhythmic, still pointing those two fingers toward my chest like he was marking me. The smile never wavered. Then, without hurry, he turned and walked away into the shadows, still murmuring in that unsettling tongue, occasionally letting out a soft, satisfied chuckle. I stood there frozen, heart hammering, the metallic smell of blood thick in the air. When Randy and Joy returned, I told them what happened. We agreed on a version of the story that wouldn't get us fired, then called dispatch. They said they'd look for him, but since the scene had already been cleared for forensics, he hadn't technically committed a serious crime, just a psych hold at best. We finished cleaning the alley in silence, scrubbing away every trace of the girl's violent end, while my mind replayed the image of that man licking her blood from his fingers with undisguised ecstasy. Randy tried to joke about it later. "You ran into a vampire, bro." We all laughed at the same time, weak, nervous laughter. But years later, that joke doesn't feel funny anymore. What haunts me isn't the blood or the gore I've cleaned for years. It's the memory of his face, that look of profound, almost holy joy as he consumed what was left of a murdered girl. The calm intelligence behind his eyes, the way he spoke those ancient sounding words like he knew exactly what he was doing. Late at night, when I'm alone, I still feel it. That cold tingling on the back of my neck, as if unseen eyes are watching me. As if somewhere out there in the shadows of the street, of the city, that man is still walking the streets with blood on his lips and that same blissful smile. And I wonder if he ever finished whatever he started when he pointed those fingers at me. Some stains don't wash away, no matter how much enzyme spray you use. Some things get inside you and stay there forever. I still do my job. I still show up when the city calls, but every time I pull up to a fresh scene, I find myself scanning the darkness, half expecting to see a figure in a dark trench coat step forward, smiling that same terrible, satisfied smile, waiting for another taste. The Black Barn and the Screaming Grandmother. I grew up in the late 1980s and early 1990s on the frozen, wind-scoured plains of rural Minnesota. But my childhood was never like anyone else's. Not really. From the outside, perhaps it looked ordinary enough. Kids watching television, attending church, playing primitive video games on our Commodore 64. But the truth was far darker, far more suffocating. We lived sealed inside an invisible snow globe, and every flake that fell around us was a warning from God, or from something pretending to be Him. Our world was ruled by my grandfather, a man we called Shepherd. He was tall, gaunt, with eyes that seemed to burn straight through flesh and into the soul. When he spoke of the end times, his voice carried the weight of coming judgment, and we all believed him. We had no choice. The family had drifted from one strict set to another until we finally broke away entirely, gathering a handful of other true believers on a remote farm complex hidden along endless fields and skeletal woods. There, life narrowed to two things: back-breaking farm labor and the Bible, interpreted solely through Grandpa's iron will. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., long before the sun clawed its way over the horizon, we gathered in the big barn the men had painted entirely black. It loomed against the gray sky like a wound cut into the world. Inside, the air always smelled of damp hay, old blood from slaughtered animals, and something sharper, something almost metallic. We knelt on the cold dirt floor while Grandpa led communal prayers, begging God to shield us from the approaching apocalypse. His voice would rise and fall like a funeral dirge, warning that Satan's grip on the world grew tighter every day. Sickness was never merely illness. It was demonic infestation. Grandpa forbade all modern medicine, calling it the devil's crutch. To accept a doctor's help was to announce your lack of faith to heaven itself. I still remember the winter my little brother fell deathly ill. What I now know was likely pneumonia racked his small body with fever and rattled lungs that sounded like bones scraping together. We prayed without cease. Grandpa laid his heavy, calloused hands on my brother's chest, shouting scripture while we fasted and even flagellated ourselves in atonement. The crack of belts against bare skin echoed through the house at night. There were no antibiotics, no hospitals, only anointing oil smeared across his burning forehead and endless desperate prayers. When he miraculously pulled through, Grandpa declared it was a divine victory. He wept with joy. But not every child was so fortunate. Before I turned 10, I stood shivering in the snow at 2 funerals where the coffins were heartbreakingly small. We buried them in our secret family cemetery behind the Black Barn, unmarked graves that the county never knew existed. Births and deaths went unreported. Taxes were evaded through cunning and isolation. We bartered with neighboring farms for what we needed and kept the outside world at arm's length. Outsiders were worldly, a word that dripped with contempt and fear. To mingle with them was to invite corruption, perhaps even damnation. Summers brought fleeting moments of deceptive peace. Berry picking, swimming in the icy creek, bonfires before we sang hymns and shared trembling testimonies of faith. Yet, even then, the shadow never lifted. Every laugh was edged with the knowledge that the world beyond our fences was rotting under Satan's touch. Winters were worse. We huddled around wood stoves, memorizing scriptures by flickering flashlight when the generators failed, the wind howling like damned souls outside the windows. Christmas was stripped of joy, reduced to a quiet meal and marathon prayers in the Black Barn, because Grandpa said the holiday had been poisoned by greed and paganism. We caught only fractured glimpses of the real 1990s through the television Grandpa occasionally allowed. The Gulf War, which he insisted proved the final battle was near. Ruby Ridge and Waco, which he used as proof that the government was actively hunting true believers. Y2K, which became the subject of feverish sermons for months. We drilled the government raids, hiding in root cellars with rifles clutching in small hands, hearts pounding at every distant engine sound. The fear was constant, a low, cold hum beneath every waking moment. Then came the autumn of 1997, just before my 15th birthday. That was when the true nightmare began. My grandmother had been making dinner when something inside her snapped. Without warning, she attacked Grandpa with a kitchen knife. The men dragged her screaming and thrashing across the yard toward the Black Barn. I watched from the porch, frozen in horror. She fought like a wild animal, kicking, clawing, biting. They had to wrap her head in cloth to protect themselves. Even then, I could see her eyes, wide, rolling, no longer fully human. They locked her inside the chapel barn, shackled to an old metal bed frame on a filthy mattress. At first, I believed it was a temporary trial. Grandpa announced she had been possessed. We all prayed fervently from our houses, since the barn was now forbidden to us. Night after night, her screams drifted from the dark fields like something torn from hell itself. They were not the cries of an old woman in pain. They rose and fell in unnatural patterns, sometimes guttural and animalistic, sometimes speaking in voices that didn't sound like hers at all. They went on until she lost her voice near dawn. only to begin again the following night. Grandpa tended to her alone for hours each evening, laying hands on her, casting out demons with increasing desperation. One morning, he returned looking like a corpse, pale, hollow-eyed, shoulders slumped as though the weight of the world had finally crushed him. Later, I learned why. During one of those long nights, he had become convinced that the entity inside my grandmother was no ordinary demon. It was Leviathan, one of the great princes of hell, a creature of impenetrable scales and corrosive fire, nearly impossible to expel. To Grandpa, this was both terrifying and exhilarating. The Bible spoke of Leviathan being served up as food for the righteous in the end times. He believed God had chosen him for a cosmic honor to defeat this ancient serpent, prove his worth, and help usher in the rapture. But as the weeks dragged on and grandmother only grew worse, wasting away, her screams turning to wet, choking rasps, his certainly cracked. If he could not cast Leviathan out, it meant God had abandoned him. And if God had abandoned the shepherd, then he had abandoned us all. We felt his terror in the air itself. Sermons grew shorter, more frantic. His face aged decades in weeks. One evening, he gathered every soul on the farm, men, women, and terrified children, and made us form a circle around the black barn. We prayed aloud in the freezing wind while grandmother's voice shredded the night from within. She screamed warnings. "He's the devil. You need to get out. Get far away from here." At the time, we thought it was the demon speaking. Now those words echo in my nightmares as perhaps the only honest thing ever uttered on that cursed farm. After the circle prayer, Grandpa resorted to beating the devil out of her. We could hear the dull, rhythmic thuds even from our houses. We ate dinner in silence, trying not to flinch with every impact. Finally, one gray afternoon, my parents told us it was time to say goodbye. We filed into the black barn in small groups. The smell hit me first. Unwashed flesh, sickness, and something fouler, like decay already setting in. Grandmother lay on the stained mattress, little more than a skeleton draped in pale skin. Her eyes were open but vacant, staring at nothing. She took shallow, rattling breaths. I don't know what Grandpa had done to her mind in those final weeks, but the woman who had once baked bread and sung softly while working was gone. Only a broken shell remained. We whispered tearful goodbyes. She did not respond. Grandpa stood in the corner like a defeated specter, eyes empty. After her death, we buried her in the secret cemetery. Grandpa withdrew completely. He spent his days inside the black barn, kneeling beside the same filthy mattress, supposedly praying for her soul. In truth, I believe he was slowly killing himself through starvation and guilt. He wasted away before our eyes. Sermons became whispers. Then, one cold morning, he walked into the woods and simply vanished. My father claimed the angels had taken him to be with grandmother. I have darker suspicions. With Grandpa gone, my father took control, and things slowly loosened. They needed an attorney to protect the farm from the outside world. So they chose me, the oldest and brightest, to be sent into enemy territory I was to attend a private Christian college, become a lawyer, and return as their shield. College shattered everything. The more I learned, the more the carefully constructed lies of my childhood crumbled. The possession, the refusal of medicine, the beatings, the isolation. It all revealed itself as fanaticism and abuse dressed in religious clothing. My grandmother hadn't been possessed by a Leviathan. She had been tortured, starved, and beaten to death by the people who claimed to love her most, including my own parents. A deep, clawing depression swallowed me. I realized too late to save her. Grandpa was already gone, beyond justice. But the others, the ones who stood by, who had prayed while she screamed, who had helped confine her, were still alive. I contacted the police. They investigated but found insufficient evidence for charges. The man with all the answers had disappeared into the woods years earlier. Still, the visit from law enforcement sent shockwaves through the farm. When my parents' letters began arriving at my college mailbox, filled with confusion and growing rage, I denied everything. I couldn't risk exposure until I had finished my degree and secured my escape. Eventually, I wrote them a letter confessing what I had done. I told them I had tried to have them arrested for their role in grandmother's murder. At the bottom, I added a postscript. I was moving somewhere they would never find me. I included a check to repay every cent they had spent on my education. My father cashed it. With that transaction, I bought my freedom. I still believe in God, but not the vengeful, terror-filled deity of the Black Barn. I pray for my parents most nights, and not out of my warmth, but because it is the last shred of mercy I can offer the people who helped murder my grandmother in the name of faith. Late at night, I still hear those screams drifting across frozen fields that no longer exist. I see the Black Barn hulking against a colorless sky, and I wonder if Leviathan was ever real, or if the true monster was the man who wore God's name like a crown while he slowly destroyed everyone around him. I escaped, but some part of me never fully left that snow globe. On the darkest nights, I can still feel it, cold, sealed, and watching. The hollow that watched me back. I have been camping my whole life. The woods were never strangers to me. They were family. I grew up making weekend pilgrimages with my parents to Seneca Rocks and Dolly Sods, learning the language of the mountains before I could drive. By the time I was 12, I could pitch a tent in total darkness and coax a fire from wet wood with nothing but patience and a knife. At 31, I worked commercial HVAC in Charleston, West Virginia. I mention this only so you understand. What happened to me last July was not the panic fantasy of some soft city kid who had wandered too far from pavement. I knew those mountains. I had spent roughly 200 nights sleeping on their forest floor. I had hiked the exact loop I planned twice before. None of that mattered. The trip was a 4-day circuit through the cranberry backcountry, deep inside the Monongahela National Forest in Pocahontas County, one of the last truly remote places left in the eastern United States. Over 47,000 acres of wilderness, with the backcountry stretching the roadless zone even farther. No cell service. The last reliable signal died 40 minutes outside Richwood, back at the trailhead parking lot at Big Beachy. I had studied the maps obsessively, both before and especially after. I started on Tuesday, July 14th, 2025. The air was thick, the way only a West Virginia summer can be. Low 80s by day, 60s at night. Humidity so heavy, my shirt clung to my back before I even locked the truck. I signed the trail register, noted my route, and expected return Friday afternoon. Only two other names appeared in the previous 3 days. Light traffic for July. I didn't think much of it then. My plan was straightforward. Big BT Trail up onto the ridge, drop into the mid-fork drainage, follow it to the country line, loop back over the top, and exit the same way I came in. 22 miles at an easy pace. I wanted to fish the middle fork for brook trout in the afternoons, and otherwise do as little as possible. The first day passed without incident. The climb up Big Beachy is a steady, lung-burning grind through second growth, hardwood, oaks, maples, and cool pockets of hemlock. I spotted a small black bear about half a mile in. He bolted the moment he saw me. I made camp that night near the junction with the Middle Fork Trail, ate a freeze-dried meal, and crawled into my tent while it was still light. The last sound I remember was an owl calling somewhere down the hollow. I woke once at 3:22 a.m., according to my old Casio watch. Something had pulled me from sleep. I lay perfectly still, listening into the velvet dark. Nothing. After a while, I drifted off again. At the time, it meant nothing. Now I wonder if that was the first time it noticed me. The second day, I descended into the Middle Fork drainage. That was when the wrongness began. Subtle at first, like a shadow you catch from the corner of your eye. The trail funnels through a narrow cut in the rock before opening into a wide, beautiful bottomland where the creek winds over sandstone, rhododendron thickets, hemlocks soaring 80 or 90 feet, water so clear it looks like glass. On my previous trips, this place had been alive with sound. Warblers, thrushes, pileated woodpeckers hammering away. Bottomland in summer is never quiet. But that day, it was. Not completely silent. There were occasional distant calls, but the forest felt muted, too even, too deliberate. The kind of quiet that makes you suddenly aware of your own breathing. Once I noticed it, I couldn't unnotice it. I told myself I was being paranoid, shook it off, and kept walking. I set up camp on a familiar little bench above the creek, a quarter mile upstream from where Big Beachy empties in. There was an old fire ring built from sandstone blocks. I filtered water, ate lunch, and spent a few peaceful hours fishing, releasing 4 small brook trout. By 6, I was back at camp cooking dinner. At 7:30, the first sound came. From upstream, maybe 100 yards away, a short, high laugh drifted through the trees. It sounded unmistakably human, female. It cut off sharply. I froze mid-bite and sat motionless for 2 to 3 minutes. Nothing followed. I told myself it was nothing. Sound plays tricks in these hollows. water over rocks, fatigue, echoes. I had heard stranger things over the years. 99 times out of 100, there's a natural explanation. 20 minutes later came the second sound. This one came from the ridge above my camp, maybe 200 feet up the slope. A man's voice, low, murmuring, a few sentences spoken too softly to make out the words, then silence. I stood up slowly. The rhododendron was so thick I could see maybe 15 feet into it. My pulse had quickened. "Hello?" I called. My voice sounded too loud in the still air. "Anyone up there?" No answer. I stood there for a full minute, staring into the green wall. The sensation that crawled over me was unmistakable. Someone was looking back at me and had chosen not to reply. The hair on the back of my neck rose. I built the fire larger than necessary that night, kept my bear spray in my jacket pocket, and sat facing the slope until well after dark. I didn't hear anything else. At 11, I doused the fire, crawled into my tent, and lay awake in the suffocating blackness with my knife beside my sleeping pad. For the first time in my life. The third day is the one that still lives beyond my eyes when the lights go out. I woke at first light, in the soft morning mist rising off the creek. The events of the night before felt ridiculous. Other hikers, probably. Birds. My imagination. I decided to take a day hike upstream to fish new ponds and, if I'm honest, to see if anyone was actually camped up there. About a mile upstream, I found the shelter. It was tucked 30 feet off the creek, hidden beneath a rock overhang in a notch you'd never notice from the water. I only spotted it because I'd climbed above a blowdown and looked down through a gap in the rhododendron. A lean-to built from branches and bark, maybe 6 feet deep and 8 feet long. Old, weathered gray, moss growing on some of the limbs, but the dirt floor inside had been swept clean, perfectly smooth. No leaves, no acorns, no twigs. In July, in those woods, that was impossible unless someone had been there very recently and deliberately cleaned it. A small fire ring sat against a flat rock at the entrance. The ashes were cold. I should have left then. Instead, I looked inside. In the back corner lay a stack of 3 untanned pelts. Stiff, dusty, too big for squirrel, too small for deer, raccoon or coyote maybe. Against the rear wall, on a flat stone, someone had arranged 11 small objects in a neat line, spaced with eerie precision, ordered from smallest to largest. A piece of yellow nylon cord, a brass button, a red reflector from the back of a hiking boot, a child's blue plastic barrette with a little bow, a plastic whistle, other fragments of metal and plastic. I can't clearly recall now. They look like trophies. I backed out of that shelter and walked straight back to my camp without stopping once. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to leave. I started breaking down camp at a frantic pace. It was early afternoon. I could make it out over Big Beachy before full dark, if I pushed hard. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that some eccentric had built the shelter years ago and left old trash behind. A child's barrette, That was all. My hand shook as I rolled the tent. I was hoisting my pack onto my back, and that's when I saw him. He stood on the far side of the creek, 40 feet away, half hidden in the deep shadow of a massive hemlock. I had no idea how long he had been there. I had not heard him approach. He was completely naked, emaciated, ribs stark against his torso. His skin was a filthy gray brown, layered with years of dirt. Long matted hair and a beard hung in tangled ropes. His eyes were sunken deep into his skull. He stood perfectly still, arms at his sides, staring directly at me. I froze with my pack half on. We looked at each other across the water. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He did not answer. He did not move. "Are you okay?" Nothing. "I'm going to leave now." Still nothing. I got my other arm through the strap, grabbed my trekking poles, and shifted my hand toward the bear spray on my shoulder strap. Then I began walking backward up the trail, never taking my eyes off of him. The last glimpse I had, his body still faced the creek, but his head had turned to keep watching me. The moment the trees swallowed him from view, I turned and ran. I ran with a full pack for a quarter mile before my body forced me to stop. Bent over, gasping, I listened. Then I heard it. A branch snapping off the trail, up the slope, soft rustling, then silence. 15 seconds later, another snap, farther along, paralleling me. He was moving with me on the ridge above. I pushed hard up the brutal climb out of the drainage, switchbacks through loose rock. My legs burned. Sweat poured off of me. Every minute or so, I caught another sound, sticks breaking, leaves shifting. Sometimes, what might have been heavy breathing. Once or twice, I thought I heard him breathing hard, but it could have just been me. I reached the ridge in record time, lungs screaming, and I was out of water. I paused at my first night's campsite, trying to catch my breath. That was when he screamed. It came from behind me, maybe 100 yards up the slope. Not a word, just a long, high, inhuman wail that went on for 5 or 6 endless seconds. It wasn't an animal. It was a man who wanted me to know pure terror. And it worked. I ran. I fell twice. The second time, my right knee popped sickeningly, but I clawed back up because I could hear him now, crashing through the brush above me, no longer trying to be quiet. He was trying to cut me off at the next switchback. What saved me was pure luck. There's an unmarked spur trail, really just an old game path, that drops off Big Beachy about 1.5 miles down from the ridge. It's steep, brutal, and not on any official map. A fishing buddy had shown it to me years earlier. It cuts miles off if you're willing to scramble. I took it. I heard him continue down the main trail for a few moments, then stop. Then he came back, realizing I had left the path. By then, I was already sliding down the near vertical slope on my backside through wet leaves, hands bleeding from grabbing rhododendron roots, knees screaming. I hit Forest Road 76 around 7 in the evening as the light began to fail. For the first time in hours, I stood under open sky. I bent over and cried, deep, shaking sobs. Then I started walking. 10 minutes later, an old Ford pickup appeared behind me. The driver, a local in his 60s, took one look at me and told me to get in. He didn't ask questions until we reached pavement. When I finally told him everything, he listened in silence. Then he said something that still chills me. I've lived in Pocahontas County my whole life. People go missing in these woods. Not often enough for the state to care, but it happens. My cousin's boy in '98, a couple from Ohio in '09, a hunter in 2015. Experienced people. Good weather. Just gone. He drove me to the sheriff's station in Marylandton. 2 days later, the state police and FBI wanted to talk. They found the shelter exactly as I described it. They found the pelt. They found a little row of trophies. The blue beret belonged to 9-year-old Emma Whitfield, who vanished from Summit Lake in 2019 while her parents slept in the next tent. The brass button came from a 1970s Army coat. The red reflector likely belonged to Robert Harkness, missing since 2021. In the weeks that followed, a full forensic search uncovered partial skeletal remains of at least 4 people buried at different depths in the hollow, some dating back to the 1990s, others only a couple of years old. They never caught him that summer. But 8 months later, in March of 2026, Sergeant Mullins called me again. They had found a body in a ravine 30 miles south, just over the border into the George Washington and Jefferson National Forest in Virginia. Adult male, naked, extremely emaciated, dead from exposure after a late winter storm. DNA identified him as Earl Lindley Sutton. He had walked away from Western State Hospital in March of 1984 at the age of 22 after being committed for stabbing his mother and sister to death in Hacker Valley when he was 19. He was 64 when they found him. He had lived in those mountains for 42 years. Fibers and DNA from the shelter matched the body. Hair from the shelter matched 2 of the buried victims. The man who stood across the lake staring at me with those sunken eyes was Earl Lindley Sutton. The man who had screamed at me from the ridge like something that had forgotten how to be human had been hunting these woods longer than I had been alive. I think about how close it was every single day. If I hadn't remembered that unmarked spur trail, he would have cut me off on the switchback. I had zero doubt I would have become another set of bones arranged neatly in that hollow, and my mother would be waiting for answers that would never come. I am alive because an old fishing buddy wanted to get back to his truck in time for a football game 4 years earlier. When the house is quiet and the night is deep, I can still hear that scream echoing down Big Beachy Ridge. And I wonder how many others never made it out. How many times that high, terrible laugh drifted through the trees, and no one was left to tell the story. And that, dear listeners, brings a close to more true, disturbing stories. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for supporting this video and Back to Ashes. I can't put into words how much that means to me, but without you, I don't have a voice, and this channel does not exist. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. If you are sleeping, I hope Slumberland is treating you comfortably. If you're awake, I hope you've enjoyed these selections. In the meantime, please stay vigilant and keep yourself safe. I'll be reading to you soon. Have yourselves a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good evening. Peace, love, and light to you all.